In the glittering halls of European power, where dynasties rose and crumbled under the ambitions of men, one monarch stood apart, not for his victories or intellect, but for the consuming darkness that ruled his soul. Philip V of Spain reigned for nearly 50 years, yet history remembers him not as a hero or conqueror, but as a man enslaved by his obsessions. His love became a prison, his devotion turned to delirium, and his monarchy spiraled into slow-moving ruin. This is the haunting tale of a ruler who commanded half the world while being utterly commanded by his own demons. A story of grief, possession, and a descent into madness so profound that it cast its shadow over Spain for 4 decades. The year was 1683 when Philip was born into the illustrious House of Bourbon at the Palace of Versailles, the Gavi, second son of Louis the Grand Dauphin of France and grandson of the legendary Sun King, Louis XIV. From birth, greatness was not his destiny. That role belonged to his elder brother. Philip grew beneath the golden ceilings of Versailles, surrounded by the rigid precision of royal life, the endless rituals, the whispers of courtiers, the suffocating weight of perfection. Yet even in childhood, those around him sensed something strange in the young prince. He often withdrew into silence, his gaze distant and unfocused, as though his mind lived in another world entirely. While other princes learned diplomacy and strategy with excitement, Philip turned inward, uninterested in the games of power that defined his family's empire. Tutors noted with unease that he could sit perfectly still for hours, staring at nothing, answering questions only after long, eerie pauses. The only person who seemed to reach him was his mother, Marie Anne of Bavaria. Philip clung to her with a desperation that unsettled even the tolerant standards of royal child-rearing. He followed her through the echoing corridors of Versailles like a ghost, and if separated from her for even a short while, he would collapse into fits of weeping and trembling. That lasted for hours. Courtiers began to whisper that the boy was afflicted by melancholy, a mysterious ailment of the soul that physicians could neither explain nor cure. Some suspected it was a family curse. The Habsburg bloodline from his grandmother was infamous for its peculiarities, its generations of intermarriage producing unstable minds and frail bodies. Others whispered that Philip had inherited his great-grandmother's melancholia, an unshakable sadness that no crown or comfort could banish. Whatever the cause, the darkness within him had already begun to spread, creeping through his spirit like roots that would one day choke everything he touched. When Philip was just 14, tragedy struck, the sudden death of his mother. The impact was devastating. Witnesses claimed he did not shed a single tear at first. He stood motionless at her bedside for nearly a full day, refusing food, drink, or rest, his hollow eyes locked on her lifeless face, as though he could summon her back to life through sheer will. When servants finally pulled him away, Philip collapsed into what doctors called a living death. For weeks, he locked himself in his chambers, speaking to no one, eating just enough to survive, pale and ghost-like. Versailles continued its glittering dance of politics and pleasure, but behind his closed doors, Philip was already slipping into the abyss that would define his reign. He might have remained nothing more than a tragic footnote in France's royal chronicles, a melancholy prince lost in his own mind, but fate had grander, darker plans. In November 1700, King Charles II of Spain died without an heir, and all of Europe froze in anticipation. The Spanish Empire was the most coveted prize in the world. Its reach spanned from the Americas to the Philippines, its wealth immeasurable, its influence vast enough to shift the balance of power across the continent. Charles II, the last of the Spanish Habsburgs, had been a pitiful figure himself, so inbred that he could barely speak or walk, his body living proof of the dynasty's decay. On his deathbed, surrounded by priests and courtiers, he made a shocking decision. He named Philip, Duke of Anjou, as his heir. At only 17, the frail, grief-stricken boy who had struggled to exist without his mother was suddenly handed one of the greatest empires on earth. King Louis XIV of France, ever the strategist, saw both opportunity and danger in this turn of fate. With careful precision, he prepared his grandson's departure for Spain. Philip was dressed in the finest Spanish attire, surrounded by loyal Spanish advisors, and sent across the Pyrenees to claim his inheritance. But before he departed, the Sun King gave him a warning that would echo through history. Be a good Spaniard. That is now your first duty. But remember, you were born a Frenchman. Philip would succeed at neither. The journey to Madrid was a torment for the fragile young monarch. Torn from the familiar corridors of Versailles and stripped of the rituals that had anchored his fragile mind, Philip descended once again into the panic that had haunted him since childhood. His attendants later confessed that the journey to Spain was a torment for the young monarch. He wept openly along the road, had to be gently coaxed from his carriage at every stop, and trembled violently before the cheering crowds gathered to greet their new king. When he finally reached Madrid in February 1701, the Spanish court was stunned. This was no confident ruler ushering in a golden age. It was a pale, fragile boy whose eyes darted nervously across the throne room, who flinched at sudden noises, and who seemed perpetually ready to flee back to France. The nobility, weary of the ghost-like presence of Charles II, had hoped for renewal. Instead, they were presented with a monarch who could barely speak during his own coronation, who required whispered prompts from his advisors, and who looked as if he might collapse under the weight of the crown itself. But Louis XIV and his advisors in France had foreseen this very problem. They knew Philip could not rule alone. What he needed was an anchor, someone to absorb his desperate dependence and shape it into something resembling leadership. Their solution was simple and political: marriage. The chosen bride was Maria Luisa Gabriela of Savoy, a princess of just 13 years, beautiful, refined, and completely unprepared for the darkness awaiting her. Maria Luisa arrived in Spain in September 1701, and the wedding was celebrated with all the splendor the Spanish court could summon. The young queen seemed a gift from heaven, elegant, intelligent, fluent in several languages, and blessed with rare political insight. She grasped the intricate web of alliances that defined European diplomacy and took genuine interest in the welfare of her new people. The Spanish public, weary of instability and the eerie spectacle of Charles II's final years, adored her, but their hope would not last. Maria Luisa had not married a king. She had married a prison, and Philip would soon become her warden. From their wedding night onward, Philip's devotion crossed into obsession. He refused to let his young wife out of sight, not for a moment, not for any reason. Royal protocol demanded that the king and queen keep separate apartments and only appear together at formal occasions. Philip shattered those traditions within days. Maria Luisa was moved permanently into his chambers. Her own apartment stood empty and silent. Every hour of her day became bound to him. When he dined, she sat beside him. When he met with ministers, she was there. When he slept, she lay next to him, often kept awake by his nightmares and muttered words that filled the night with dread. It didn't take long for Maria Luisa to realize the truth. She was not a queen, but a charm. Her presence the only shield between Philip and his unraveling mind. Servants whispered that through the palace walls they could hear the king's cries in the night, sometimes weeping, sometimes screaming, sometimes whimpering like a lost child, and always Maria Luisa's soft voice trying to calm him, to pull him back from the edge. By day, she performed her duties with poise and grace, but those close to her saw the cracks forming. Her hands trembled when she thought no one was watching. The color drained from her cheeks. Dark shadows lingered beneath her eyes. Ambassadors noted that audiences with the king often turned absurd. Officials would wait hours outside his chambers because Philip refused to appear without his wife. Even when Maria Luisa fell ill from exhaustion, Philip demanded she be carried wherever he went. The queen's ladies grew accustomed to the disturbing ritual of dressing her under the king's fixed, obsessive gaze. He refused to leave the room, his eyes following her every movement with unnerving intensity. Physicians were summoned, but medicine in the early 18th century had no cure for such torment. They prescribed the usual superstitions, bloodletting, purgatives, and special diets, but nothing could reach the fractured depths of Philip's mind. Reports of his condition reached France, where his grandfather Louis XIV grew deeply alarmed. This was not the strong Bourbon monarch meant to secure the dynasty in Spain. This was a man unraveling, clinging desperately to a teenage girl who was slowly breaking under his dependence. The Sun King sent doctors, advisors, even priests to Madrid, but Philip refused them all. He could not be separated from Maria Luisa. As months turned into years, the toll on the young queen became impossible to ignore. The radiant child who had arrived in Spain at 13 began to wither before their eyes. By 17, she looked twice her age. By 20, she seemed an old woman. The endless anxiety, sleepless nights, and crushing emotional strain were eroding her from within. Illness became her constant companion, but she never complained. Perhaps she understood that her husband's sanity depended entirely on her presence. Or perhaps she had resigned herself to her fate, the heavy price of wearing a crown. Despite her frailty, the queen fulfilled her most vital duty. She bore heirs. Between 1707 and 1714, Maria Luisa gave birth to 4 surviving sons, Louis, Philip, Ferdinand, and Charles. But even pregnancy offered no refuge. Philip insisted on being present for every birth, a shocking violation of royal custom that scandalized the court. Witnesses said he would pace the chamber, growing frantic at each of his wife's screams, often needing to be restrained from interfering with the midwives. And afterward, instead of allowing her time to recover, he demanded her company within days, unable to bear her absence even for a moment. The Spanish court, once hopeful that marriage might steady the troubled king, watched in dread as the opposite occurred. Philip withdrew further from his royal duties. Papers went unsigned, petitions unanswered, while he sat in silence beside his queen, sometimes speaking softly, sometimes staring at her for hours as though she might vanish if he looked away. Foreign diplomats soon reported back to their governments that Spain was no longer ruled by its king, but by its exhausted queen and a handful of capable ministers struggling to keep the empire afloat. While the king lived in a constant state of anxiety, his world had shrunk entirely to the presence of his wife. Then, in February 1714, tragedy struck. Maria Luisa of Savoy was dead. She was only 25, her body finally giving out after 13 years of carrying the unbearable weight of being Philip V's sole tether to reality. The official account claimed she died from an abscess after a miscarriage, but many historians believe the truth was far simpler and far more tragic. She died of exhaustion. Her spirit, worn down by years of sleepless nights and emotional torment, finally surrendered. As she lay dying, Philip was at her bedside as always, clutching her hand and begging her not to leave him. Witnesses recalled how his pleas grew louder, his sobs rising into screams as her breathing faded and stopped. What happened next horrified even those accustomed to the king's peculiarities. Philip did not merely grieve, he unraveled. He refused to leave her body. For 3 entire days he remained beside her corpse, holding her cold hand, speaking to her as though she still lived. Servants who entered the chamber said the king appeared detached from reality, sometimes smiling at empty air, sometimes laughing at shared memories, even imitating the dead queen's voice in a falsetto, answering himself as though she were still there. When the odor of decay finally made it impossible to ignore, the servants forcibly removed him. What followed was described by royal physicians as total madness. Philip refused food and water, screaming that he would die and follow his wife to the grave. He clawed at his hair and face until he bled, tore his clothing to shreds, and had to be restrained from harming himself. The palace was plunged into darkness. Philip insisted that light burned his eyes. He refused to let his rooms be cleaned, and soon the stench of filth and decay spread through the royal apartments. Spain, already entangled in the War of the Spanish Succession and besieged by enemies on all sides, now found itself effectively without a ruler. Panic spread through the government. Louis XIV and the Spanish ministers knew something had to be done. Philip could not continue like this. The monarchy itself was collapsing. But how could one help a man who refused to live? After weeks of desperate deliberation, They settled on a solution as unsettling as it was pragmatic. Philip needed another wife. Someone who could fulfill the role Maria Luisa had played, a living anchor to pull him back from oblivion. The search began immediately, but this time, the criteria were different. They needed someone older, stronger, and mentally capable of bearing the weight that had crushed Maria Luisa. Their choice was Elizabeth Farnese, niece of the Duke of Parma. At 22, she was older, better educated, and known for her fierce intelligence and unyielding will. The marriage was arranged with astonishing speed. Barely 6 months after Maria Luisa's death, Elizabeth was on her way to Spain. But nothing could have prepared her for what awaited. Philip had emerged from his mourning chamber, but he was a ghost of himself, gaunt, hollow-eyed, trembling with a nervous tic that never left him. And he had one disturbing demand for his new bride. When Elizabeth first met the king, he presented her with a chest containing Maria Luisa's dresses and jewelry. Through his advisor, he informed her that she would wear these garments, style her hair as his first wife had, and take her exact place in his life. Elizabeth, sharp enough to understand the stakes, knew refusal was not an option. This was not a marriage, it was a role, and Spain's stability depended on her performance. So she donned the dead queen's gowns, arranged her hair in Maria Luisa's fashion, and stepped into the impossible position of being both herself and a ghost. Surprisingly, the arrangement worked, at least for a time. With this carefully crafted echo of his lost wife, Philip regained a semblance of stability and resumed his royal duties. But Elizabeth soon discovered what Maria Luisa had learned years earlier. Philip did not want a wife. He wanted a mirror, someone who could reflect his own desperate need for control and affection. Like her predecessor, Elizabeth was rarely allowed from his sight. She slept beside him, attended every meeting, followed him to every engagement. Her entire existence revolved around his moods. But Elizabeth Farnese was not Maria Luisa. Where the late queen had been tender and submissive, Elizabeth was cunning and ambitious. She quickly realized that proximity to the king meant power. If she was to endure the madness, she would at least use it to her advantage. And she did, brilliantly. While Philip sank deeper into his delusions, Elizabeth ruled Spain in all but name. She manipulated ministers, brokered alliances, and gradually built a political empire of her own, securing her place among the most influential queens in Spanish history. Yet her power came at a harrowing cost. Elizabeth bore Philip 7 children. Each pregnancy endured under the same suffocating conditions as before. The king's obsession with her presence never eased. She had no privacy, no peace, and no relief from the crushing responsibility of holding another human being's sanity together. In private letters to her family, Elizabeth confessed her torment. She wrote that she felt as if she were drowning, her own identity dissolving under the constant strain of being whatever Philip needed her to be. As the 1720s unfolded, Philip's mental state decayed further. The delusions that had once lingered at the edges of his mind now consumed him entirely. He became convinced he was dying, though he remained physically sound. He spent hours examining his body for imagined illnesses, demanding doctors at all hours to confirm what did not exist. When Elizabeth tried to comfort him, he accused her of deception, claiming she wished him dead so she could be free. The accusations sometimes turned violent. He would throw objects, scream at servants, and once even struck Elizabeth across the face before collapsing in tears, begging forgiveness. His hygiene, never strong to begin with, deteriorated completely. Philip became terrified of water, insisting that bathing would make him ill. Weeks, then months, passed without him changing clothes or washing. The smell became so overwhelming that courtiers invented excuses to avoid him, dousing themselves in perfume when duty required their presence. Elizabeth, forced to share his bed each night, endured what she once described as sleeping beside a corpse that breathes. She wrote to her brother that she felt as though she were married to a ghost of a man, one who consumed her life without ever truly living his own. Then, in January 1724, Philip made a decision that stunned Europe. He abdicated. At just 40, the king renounced the throne in favor of his 17-year-old son, Louis, announcing his intent to live out his days in religious solitude. Historians still debate why. Was it exhaustion, guilt, or perhaps the final surrender of a man whose mind had long ago ceased to be his own? Some believed Philip's abdication was born from exhaustion, a desperate attempt to escape the crushing weight of the crown. Others whispered it was Elizabeth's doing, a calculated move to isolate her husband in hopes that time away from the throne might restore his mind. But those closest to the king insisted the truth was darker. Philip had convinced himself that remaining king was a sin, that his unworthiness poisoned the monarchy itself, and that only by surrendering his crown could he cleanse his soul. Yet peace never came. Philip and Elizabeth retreated to the secluded palace of La Granja de San Ildefonso, a grand estate he had built to mimic the splendor of Versailles. But stripped of the rigid structure of court life, Philip's mind began to unravel even faster. His days and nights blurred. He wandered the palace halls in the dark, muttering to himself while sleeping through the daylight hours. His obsession with religion deepened into something unrecognizable. Hours of frantic prayer, strange chanting in tongues, and sudden claims of visions from saints. He demanded that Elizabeth kneel beside him during these endless sessions. She obeyed, bleeding from her knees, her body trembling with exhaustion as his voice echoed through the chapel. Back in Madrid, the young King Louis reigned, but fate had not finished with the Bourbons. Barely 7 months after his coronation, in August 1724, the 17-year-old king contracted smallpox. The disease tore through his body with terrifying speed. Within days, the court knew he would not survive. When the news reached Philip, his reaction chilled those around him. Was it grief or something more sinister? Some witnesses swore they saw a flicker of relief, as though Philip believed God had confirmed his divine fears about the curse of kingship. Louis's death on August 31, 1724, plunged Spain into chaos. With no heir and the next in line, Ferdinand, still a child, the government, church, and nobility were forced to face a grim reality. The crown must return to Philip. When envoys arrived at La Granja to deliver the news, the former king's response left them stunned. He did not argue or resist. Instead, he smiled, a thin, unsettling smile, and simply said he had always known God would summon him back. To some, it felt less like acceptance and more like prophecy fulfilled, as though Philip's abdication had been a divine test he had just passed. His return to Madrid in September marked a chilling transformation. Whatever sanity he once possessed was gone. The man who resumed the throne was no longer a ruler, but a specter draped in flesh. He refused royal garments, dressing only in the robes of a monk, even for state occasions. Foreign ambassadors expecting a king were instead met by a frail, wild-eyed figure in filthy brown robes, his nails yellow and overgrown, his beard untrimmed. His daily life descended into disturbing disorder. He reversed day and night, sleeping by daylight and wandering through shadowed corridors at night, humming fractured hymns and half-remembered lullabies. Sometimes he stood motionless for hours in the darkness, his gaze fixed on nothing. Servants avoided crossing his path, terrified by his blank stare and murmured conversations with unseen presences. Elizabeth Farnese's existence became unbearable. Her husband's erratic sleep meant she could never rest. Whenever she tried to sleep during the day, he would awaken suddenly and lash out if she wasn't there. Desperate physicians tried everything: bloodletting, herbal tonics, strict diets, even immersing the king in icy baths to shock him into reason. Nothing worked. Philip was lost in a world ruled by terrors only he could see. His delusions turned grotesque. He claimed his body was rotting, spending hours examining his skin for signs of decay. Then he insisted worms were devouring his organs, describing the sensation in chilling detail to horrified courtiers. When doctors assured him he was healthy, he flew into rages, accusing them of conspiring to hide his true condition. His aversion to bathing became absolute. He screamed and thrashed if anyone tried to wash him, declaring that water would destroy him. Months passed, then years, without a single bath. His body erupted with sores, his teeth decayed, and his hair matted with lice. The odor from his chambers became so unbearable that attendants masked their faces with scented cloths and drenched themselves in perfume before entering. Through it all, Elizabeth was forced to endure the unimaginable, sharing his bed each night, lying beside the stinking, delusional shell of a man who had once been her husband. Yet somehow Spain endured. The Queen, brilliant and calculating, turned her suffering into strategy. She learned to anticipate Philip's moods, to guide his hallucinations in ways that served her aims, and to make her own political decisions appear as his divine will. Courtiers and ministers quickly adapted. They brought their petitions to Elizabeth, knowing she would reframe them for Philip's fragile mind. Diplomats understood that while the king wore the crown, the true ruler of Spain was its queen. It was a fiction everyone agreed to maintain. As the years passed, Philip's relationship with his children disintegrated. He could barely recall their names, often confusing the living with those who had died. His son Ferdinand later confessed in private letters that he had grown up feeling fatherless, that the creature who bore his father's face was something entirely different, something that filled him with quiet terror. By the 1730s, Philip's religious mania consumed him completely. He claimed God spoke directly to him, dictating messages that he forced trembling scribes to record at all hours of the night. These divine orders ranged from the nonsensical to the absurd, declarations of new holy days, demands for new monasteries, and rambling prophecies about the world's end. Each one reminded his court that the King of Spain had long since crossed the line. Between faith and madness, the Church found itself trapped in an impossible dilemma. Torn between honoring a divinely appointed monarch and confronting behavior that bordered on blasphemy. When priests tried to gently question the king's supposed visions, Philip erupted in fury, accusing them of doubting God's will. His rages could be terrifying, his voice echoing through the palace like thunder. Only music seemed capable of soothing the storm within him. The celebrated castrato singer Farinelli was summoned to court for a single purpose: to sing for the king. Each evening, Farinelli performed the same 4 arias, and Philip would sit motionless, tears glistening on his cheeks as the melodies quieted his tormented mind. For those brief moments, he appeared almost human again. This ritual continued for years, with Farinelli essentially imprisoned by his gift, trapped, just as Elizabeth was, in the service of the king's fragile sanity. Yet even this fragile comfort twisted into delusion. Philip became convinced that Farinelli's voice was not mortal at all, but angelic, a divine messenger sent to prepare him for death. As the years passed and Philip entered his 60s, his body began to fail in ways his mind refused to accept. Decades of neglect, poor hygiene, and unrelenting stress took their toll. Painful ulcers covered his legs, his rotting teeth brought constant agony, and his trembling hands could no longer hold a pen. Trusted secretaries were forced to forge his signature, while the king himself remained lost in his own fevered imagination. The palace around him began to mirror his decay. Once a symbol of royal power, it became a place of whispers and half-light, its corridors silent and heavy with dread. Courtiers moved like ghosts through the gloom, terrified to make noise that might disturb the king's madness. Visitors from foreign courts were horrified by what they saw. Instead of the splendor of Spain's monarchy, they found something closer to a mausoleum, a haunted palace ruled by a living ghost. Elizabeth Farnese, after more than 30 years of this existence, had become a shadow of herself. Those who saw her in Philip's final years described her as mechanical, performing the duties of devotion without expression or emotion. At 52, she looked decades older, her beauty eroded by sleepless nights and constant strain. Yet she never wavered. To falter, even for a moment, would mean the illusion of stability, and her own power would collapse entirely. In July 1746, Philip V finally died at the Buen Retiro Palace in Madrid. He was 62 years old and had reigned, with one interruption, for 45 years, one of the longest reigns in Spanish history. The official cause of death was listed as a stroke. But everyone knew his body had simply given out after decades of torment and neglect. His final days were anything but peaceful. Witnesses described him raving endlessly, speaking to people long dead, fighting invisible enemies, and crying out for his mother and his beloved Maria Luisa. Elizabeth remained at his side to the very end, holding his hand as he took his last breath. Whether that gesture was born of love or habit, no one could say. Across Spain, the reaction to his death was conflicted. There was mourning, yes, after all he had been king for nearly half a century, but there was also unmistakable relief, as though a long, dark era had finally lifted. Foreign envoys noted that Madrid itself seemed to exhale, like a city waking from a nightmare. Philip's third son, Ferdinand VI, ascended the throne and proved to be everything his father was not: balanced, rational, and determined to restore order. Elizabeth, now free from her suffocating role, lived another 20 years. Those who visited her at La Granja noticed a startling transformation. Freed from the madness that had defined her life, she seemed to come alive again, devoting herself to securing thrones for her sons in Italy and wielding her influence with practiced precision. Under Ferdinand VI, the Spanish court shed its ghostly gloom. The new king ordered the royal apartments scrubbed, renovated, and restored, an exorcism of sorts to banish the shadows of his father's reign. The eerie silences, the midnight rituals, the constant tension that had ruled the palace were gone. Diplomats remarked that Madrid felt reborn, its spirit renewed almost overnight. Historians and physicians have long debated the nature of Philip's madness. By modern understanding, he likely suffered from a tangled web of mental disorders, severe anxiety, obsessive-compulsive behaviors, depression, and a progressive psychosis. His desperate dependence on his wives suggested deep-rooted trauma, perhaps born from the loss of his mother in adolescence. Whatever the diagnosis, his story remains one of the most haunting portraits of royal madness in European history, a reign defined not by power, but by torment. Philip's later delusions and hallucinations revealed a complete fracture from reality, showing the unmistakable signs of severe mental illness, likely intensified by years of royal pressure and the trauma of Maria Luisa's death. Some modern historians argue that he may have suffered from what we now recognize as clinical depression intertwined with schizophrenia. His religious visions, the voices he claimed to hear, and his distorted sense of reality all suggest a man whose mind could no longer separate the world inside his head from the one outside it. But Philip lived in an age that had no real understanding of mental illness. In his world, there were no psychiatrists, no medicine, only bloodletting, prayer, and superstition. Madness was not seen as a medical condition, but as moral failure or divine punishment. And when the madman in question wore a crown, there was no remedy, only fear and silent endurance. That is what makes Philip's story so tragic. Despite being clearly unfit to rule, he was granted absolute power over millions. The doctrine of divine right, that kings were chosen by God and answerable to him alone, made it impossible to remove him. Instead, courtiers and ministers learned to work around their unstable ruler, creating a government that operated in his name, but without his guidance. It was the only way to keep Spain functioning, but it came at a heavy cost, especially for the two women trapped closest to him. Maria Luisa of Savoy and Elizabeth Farnese remain two of the most heart-wrenching figures in royal history. Both were intelligent, capable women who could have been formidable rulers in their own right. Instead, they were reduced to serving as emotional anchors for a man sinking into madness. Maria Luisa paid with her life, dead at 25 from exhaustion and despair. Elizabeth endured for decades, transforming herself into something unbreakable, sacrificing her humanity for the sake of survival and political control. Neither woman ever truly escaped Philip's shadow. Their children, too, bore the marks of this cursed legacy. They grew up surrounded by fear, instability, and silence, forever uncertain which version of their father they would face. Some displayed signs of mental illness themselves, a grim inheritance of both genetics and trauma. The Bourbon line would continue to struggle with mental instability, though none would reach the depths of Philip VI's torment. Philip's reign left behind a legacy both productive and poisoned. On one hand, Spain saw a measure of recovery, largely due to the efforts of his ministers who ruled in his stead. Administrative reforms took shape, the economy steadied, and Spain remained a formidable European power through the wars of succession. But beneath the surface lay a darker truth. For 45 years, the nation was ruled by a man who could not rule. To survive, the system learned to fake stability, to act as though the king still reigned, even when the throne was effectively empty. What's most disturbing is how everyone knew. Ambassadors wrote home describing the king's delusions. Courtiers whispered of his outbursts. The church understood that his divine visions were symptoms of illness. And yet no one could act. Spain's monarchy had no mechanism to remove an insane ruler. The entire court simply waited, managing his moods, hiding his behavior, and hoping his madness wouldn't bring ruin. Philip's obsession with death and decay, his constant belief that he was dying, his habit of dressing like a monk, painted the picture of a man already spiritually dead. He moved through life like a living ghost, trapped in a body that refused to let him rest. When he finally died, it wasn't shocking. It was inevitable. His body had merely caught up to what his mind had already surrendered years before. Philip V left behind no grand monuments, no legendary victories, no cultural renaissance. His true legacy was written in suffering, in the wives who lost themselves trying to save him, in the children who grew up afraid of him, and in the servants who spent their lives tiptoeing through the halls of a silent palace. He proved that a king could reign without ruling, that power could survive through illusion and routine even when its bearer had collapsed completely. But the cost of maintaining that illusion was borne by real people, people whose pain history rarely remembers. Ultimately, the story of Philip V is not just about madness. It's about the price of power when it belongs to someone unable to bear it. It's about two women chained to duty, crushed by a man they could neither leave nor save. It's about how history glorifies kings and forgets queens, how entire societies protect their image by hiding insanity behind silk curtains and golden crowns. Behind every royal title and every elegant portrait lies a hidden reality, one of loneliness, pain, and endurance. Philip V's story is a haunting reminder that even the mightiest thrones rest on fragile human minds. His death on July 9, 1746, merely confirmed what had long been true. Spain's king had died in spirit decades before. Perhaps it happened when Maria Luisa took her final breath, or when a boy of 14 lost his mother and something inside him broke forever. By the time his heart stopped beating, Philip had already vanished, leaving behind only a broken shell, a crown resting on the head of a man who no longer existed.